Horror is the greatest genre ever made. This isn't a debatable opinion, it is the truth. Do not question me. The best thing about horror is that there are so many subgenres that can appeal to many different people. You've got survival horror, you've got your psychological horror, you've got your action horror, you've got your run away from things and hide under a bed horror. There are many more subgenres, and all of them provide unique and engaging experiences. But one thing I have found amongst those who don't play horror games is that they don't know what games they should play or where to start. There are so many games that it can be pretty confusing. The horror community is a passionate one, but that also means a wide variety of differing opinions. Luckily, I'm here to finally settle this debate. Here is my list of the top 5 horror games for newcomers. You can thank me later. I should first preface this list with the following statement. This is in no way reflective of my favourite horror games. Sure, some of them are pretty close to my heart, but that was not what I was aiming for when making this video. The games I have chosen are, in my humble opinion, the best titles for those who don't play horror games and they want to get their feet wet. They won't be obscure titles and in some controversial cases, fan favourites, but I'm just trying to make the transition into a new genre as smooth as possible by providing games that are accessible while still being fun, engaging and scary. So with that out of the way, let's do this. The release of Outlast changed the face of horror games. Instead of a major focus on fighting enemies, it went for a more run and hide approach. Sure, it wasn't the first to use the run and hide mechanic, but it was one of the titles that popularized that kind of game. You couldn't browse YouTube without seeing some Let's Player fake screaming into a microphone while playing this game.
Little get away! What the fuck? What the fuck? No!
But there was a reason why it launched the career of so many YouTubers. It was because the game was terrifying, but simple in its design. Players take control of freelance investigative journalist Miles Upshur, who receives an email stating brutal experiments are taking place at Mount Massive Asylum. Upshur decides to investigate these allegations and breaks into the asylum. Now, who would have thought a place named Mount Massive Asylum would have some horrifying stuff going on behind its walls? With a video camera in hand, the player must explore the asylum and uncover its secrets. What is no surprise to anyone, the asylum that is allegedly home to brutal experiments is filled with insane inmates, some of who have never heard of pants, who want nothing more than to kill the player.
And when we kill him slow.
Such patience.
I want his tongue and liver.
They are yours.
Nothing is scarier than a dick just flopping there. Now, Upshur must document the horrible crimes committed at the asylum, try not to get killed, and escape. Though the setting of an asylum is pretty cliche, Outlast does more than enough to make it terrifying. The halls of Mount Massive Asylum are spooky as hell, and its remaining inhabitants are pretty damn creepy. The game also has many great scares that will definitely freak out players who aren't familiar with horror games. What makes Outlast a great horror game for newcomers is the simplicity of the game design. Players are limited in what they can do. Though this may sound like a negative, the way the limitations are implemented make Outlast what it is. First off, the combat, or lack thereof. Most horror games have some form of combat, and more often than not, the combat is clunky. Usually, this is done deliberately to disempower the player and make the game more tense. Though there is a clear motive behind these decisions, I found that newcomers really struggle with the combat systems in older horror games. Outlast takes one step further and removes combat altogether. Players have absolutely no way of defending themselves. Even though this comes across as unrealistic as anyone who had a naked man trying to attack them would at least kick them in the balls, I think the removal of combat was a great choice because it complements another mechanic in the game. Evasion. Since the player can't fight back, all they can do is run away and hide under a bed or in a locker. This makes every encounter with an enemy extremely tense and not only forces the player to approach the game with caution, but also requires them to get the lay of the land and think on their feet if they are spotted. You need to remember where you saw lockers or beds just in case you need to hide. The only thing that may confuse newcomers is the chase mechanic and understanding how to properly evade enemies in frantic situations. This would take a little bit to get used to, but once the player does, it will become second nature. The removal of combat and focus on evasion makes Outlast one of the best horror games for newcomers. Where other games have many mechanics the player has to learn, which can be daunting for those not familiar with the horror genre. The horror genre, Outlast is a simple and pure horror experience. If you want to jump into horror but want an easier experience in terms of complexity, Outlast is a great place to start. Why would you recommend a sequel? I hear you say from the dark corners of my mind, and I get it. Usually I'd recommend starting off with the original and working your way through the series, but sometimes sequels vastly improve on the original or are detached narratively from the previous titles. But my relationship with Evil Within is a little complicated. I will probably review it in the future and go into why, but for now, let's just say my relationship with my dead father is better than my relationship with the Evil Within. Moving on from that and onto the topic at hand, why should newcomers play the Evil Within 2? Well, because it is one of the most enjoyable horror games from a big budget studio in recent years. It is extremely approachable and offers enough variety to make it a very engaging experience. In The Evil Within 2, the player takes control of Sebastian Castellanos, the most generic detective in the entire world. He is scruffy, he drinks excessively, he is troubled and haunted by his past.
You didn't save me!
But he is still a fun and interesting character considering he sounds like every detective in media. The game takes place 3 years after the original, and thankfully you don't need to play the original to grasp the sequel's story. He is taken by a woman named Julie Kidman, his partner in the original game, who puts him in a machine called STEM, which is a virtual world created using the brain of a host. In this case, Sebastian's daughter Lily, who he thought was dead. What?
What a twist!
He enters STEM because it is becoming unstable, meaning something is wrong with Lily. Some crazy murderer dude obsessed with photography is wreaking havoc alongside loads of monsters disappearing. Sebastian's goal is to save his daughter and get the hell out. Pretty simple premise, but it also provides a clear and constant motive for the player. Also, the big bad of the game is an interesting and cool villain who truly seems like an unstoppable killing menace. The monsters are also well designed and represent people who died in STEM, which is a very Silent Hill 2 twist on enemy design. Which, I kinda like that. Lastly, STEM provides a unique world to explore. The place is falling to pieces so the developer could get crazy with the world. You will see parts of the area upside down in the air. You will encounter locations that are completely detached from what STEM is supposed to be. I will keep it vague so you can experience it for yourself, but it is a damn cool game to explore. The gameplay of The Evil Within 2 is pretty simple. It is a third-person shooter with a major focus on stealth mechanics that takes place in large open maps most of the time. These 3 elements really complement each other and allow the player to approach each enemy encounter or scenario in different ways. You may want to kick off an encounter by introducing everybody to your friend, Handy McGun, or you feel like sneaking up on a few wayward bad guys, introduce them to Mr. Knifey. It is completely up to you, and the large maps allow you to approach these moments from different angles or switch from combat to stealth or vice versa on the fly. Basically what I'm saying is you can play how you want to play, which really helps for newcomers.
Whew, not bad.
The combat is easy for anyone who's played a third-person shooter, which is basically everyone if you've ever played a game within the past 10 years. The shooting feels tight and responsive, and though the aiming can be a bit finicky thanks to the swaying, it more than does the job. The weapons also offer a lot of variety. You get the standard pistol and shotgun, but you also get a crossbow that shoots numerous types of bolts, including explosive, electric, and frozen. This variety makes the crossbow one of the best weapons in the game and can be used in both combat and in stealth. Speaking of stealth, what are you looking at, stealth? Just talking about your stealth, so fucking looking at me, stealth. It works really well for how basic it is. You will mainly use it to sneak past enemies or sneak up on them and kill them. In the hands of a skilled player, they can wipe out an entire crew of enemies without anyone noticing. For everyone else, it is a great way to fiddle down enemies before the chaos kicks in. Just one little last thing. The open levels also make for great moments of exploration. Side missions will be scattered throughout each area, and these aren't the generic types found in Ubisoft games. They offer enough variety and provide rewards to incentivize the player to explore and knock them out. When you get your hands on a new weapon or upgrade material, you'll be very grateful. The Evil Within 2 offers enough variety and fun to make it a great place to jump in, and you don't need to play the original to enjoy the gameplay or the story. Its gameplay style is used so much in other genres that playing this game will feel natural. Considering my disdain for the original, I thought I would also dislike its sequel, but I found myself having a great time and believe it deserves more appreciation. Fuck, that sentence took so many goes to get. And here it is, Resident Evil 2. No, it's Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 is my favorite entry in the long-running survival horror franchise, mainly because I'm not the biggest fan of classic Resident Evil, but we'll get into that controversial opinion at a later date. The Resident Evil franchise established many conventions of the survival horror genre, and for a long time was the benchmark of the genre. But after the massive success of Resident Evil 4, the series departed from its horror roots and changed into a more action-oriented direction. Many fans of the series did not like the change, and after Resident Evil 6, a personal favourite for me because of how over the top it is, Capcom listened and went back to what made the series what it is. Resident Evil 7 was a return to survival horror, while also implementing many modern sensibilities, which makes it the perfect entry point for horror newcomers. In Resident Evil 7, players control Ethan Winters, who receives a message from his wife, Mia, who was presumed dead for 3 years. This plot is eerily similar to another game on this list, but you'll have to find that one out by just watching more. Ethan searches for his wife in a rundown shithole of a house where he encounters the Baker family, who take heavy inspiration from the family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You got Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, and Grandma. Now, I'm not going to say these guys are a fun-filled family full of cannibals, but that food sure looks human-y. What do you say, Jeff?
It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me. It gave me a sexual satisfaction to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for your input. The goal of the game is to find Mia and escape the Baker family while uncovering some of the spooky secrets. The plot in Resident Evil 7 is barely associated with the prior games, so it is a perfect place for newcomers to start since they won't be bogged down with over 2 decades of lore. I'm not the biggest fan of Resident Evil, and I understood the plot of this game perfectly. The gameplay of RE7 is a mix of more recent titles such as Outlast and classic Resident Evil. First, we will start off with the classic influence. RE7 takes the framework of classic survival horror games and modernizes them, but not in a terrible way which is usually associated with that term. The game has all of the mechanics from classic survival horror. You got your item management, limited ammo, limited health, and bucket loads of puzzles. I mean, look at all these puzzles! How these mechanics are modernized is by providing the player with a bit more leniency. In old school survival horror, the inventory size is very small and items such as ammo or health kits or even saves were very limited. This required the player to be very mindful of where they were going, what they were taking with them, and when encountering enemies, whether to engage or not, as it may use up precious ammo. RE7 gives the player more inventory space, health, and ammo, but not so much more that the player is a one-person army. Though many classic survival horror fans may cry foul of this idea as the item management and inventory space added a lot more attention to those older games, I believe it is a great middle ground that keeps old school survival horror modern while not overly simplifying it. Next is how RE7 borrows from more modern horror games. Instead of being in third person or using fixed camera angles, RE7 is in first person, much like many current horror games. This perspective shift may seem like a small change, but it is a massive one considering most of the franchise stuck to either fixed camera angles or third person. I believe it provides a more intimate viewpoint which can lead to more scares when the player encounters enemies or the Baker family. Speaking of the Bakers, this is the largest aspect of the game that takes influence from titles such as Outlast or Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Throughout the game, the player will encounter members of the Baker family who all have unique personalities and require different approaches from the player. There is one problem you will find though when facing the Bakers. They kinda don't die. Sure, you can shoot them and stab them as much as you want, but after a while, they have the habit of just getting back up and brushing it all off and just continuing to come after you. Having enemies the player can't fight or have limited options to fight is a very modern influence on RE7. It makes the Bakers formidable foes, and the players will dread encountering them, and several of the best moments in the game come from one of these lovely peoples just stumbling upon you while you're wandering around. RE7 is a fantastic horror game that put Capcom back on the map. It is an amalgamation of the past and present of survival horror and still offers a compelling and terrifying experience. If you haven't played any of the games in the franchise or are new to the genre and you want to play one of the most iconic series ever, I highly recommend starting here.
It's everything you love in a game. And your mom's gonna hate it.
Well, my mum called me a cunt once, so I don't think she cares what games I play. Terrible marketing aside, Dead Space is one of the first horror games that I played and I immediately fell in love with it and the genre. It evolved the gameplay of RE4, adding some aliens, The Thing, Event Horizon, and just a little bit of Lovecraft, and set the whole thing in space. These are the perfect ingredients for a horror soup. Dead Space was developed by EA Redwood Shores, later known as Visceral Games, and you can tell from nearly every aspect of this game, from the lore and the world to the enemy design and the combat, they poured their hearts and souls into it. Players take control of the ever so sexy and silent systems engineer Isaac Clarke. He is part of the rescue team who receives a distress beacon from the USG Ishimura, a spaceship that looks like it totally isn't full of nightmares. Luckily for Isaac, his girlfriend Nicole is stationed on the ship, and I'm assuming nothing will go wrong and they will have a romantic getaway. In classic space horror fashion, his rescue ship doesn't do much rescuing, and it crashes and the crew are stranded on the Ishimura. They soon discover the ship is infested by creatures known as necromorphs. Think the Thing mixed with some Lovecraft.
Jesus! Overfire! Overfire! Scissor power! Scissor!
The emergence of these creatures have coincided with something called the marker appearing on the ship. So you know some dodgy shit's going on with that marker right there. Isaac's plan is to escape the Ishimura with his crewmates and his girlfriend while uncovering the secrets of the marker. The plot of Dead Space is one of my favorite things about the series. I love the world and the influences it wears on its sleeves. If you really love horror and space or involving something not of this world, this plot is perfect for you. Dead Space utilizes a third-person perspective with an extremely clean heads-up display. Information the player needs to know, such as health and ammo, are not displayed on the screen in the conventional way found in similar titles. Instead, everything is displayed in some way on Isaac. The player has to pay close attention to Isaac instead of looking all over the screen. Though this sounds like a small thing, it really adds to the player's immersion. When talking about combat, Dead Space does two very interesting things that sets it apart from many other games of the same ilk. First, let's talk about weapons. Instead of giving the player access to weapons they are familiar with, such as pistols, shotguns, and machine guns, Dead Space grounds the weapons in the game's world. In Dead Space, mining is a massive industry, and the Ishimura is a spaceship designed specifically for that. So the only thing the player has access to are, mining utensils. But they are extremely effective in slicing things to pieces, and each weapon has an alternative mode of fire. Speaking of slicing, the second and best thing Dead Space does of its combat and its mining equipment weapons is how they are used. The necromorphs are extremely tough enemies, and if someone were just to shoot them, they would soon realize it has no effect and they would become very familiar with the feeling of being torn to shreds. But necromorphs have one major weakness: they are very attached to their limbs, so it's the player's job to sever that relationship. The player must dismember the necromorphs in order to defeat them, which goes against nearly everything players have been taught when killing enemies. Usually you jump on their head or shoot them in the face, not cut off their limbs. Each type of necromorph has different limbs and abilities which requires different approaches. Sometimes they will sprout tentacles from their back, which the player must cut off, or they will come running at you, so you have to cut off their legs. The player and their weapons must change and adapt depending on the engagement. Alongside the gameplay, the Ishimura is an atmospheric and haunting place to explore. Its hallways creak and rattle. Nearly every area is dimly lit. Bodies and blood are everywhere, and the player can only imagine what horrors took place in its halls. Well, I mean, you are gonna find out at some point, but it is good to imagine. It really reminds me of Nostromo from Aliens. The Ishimura becomes a character itself and is one of the scariest parts of the game. Dead Space is one of the scariest and most enjoyable survival horror games on the market. It was my gateway drug to the genre, and I believe it did the same for many others. Its sequel is one of my favorite games of all time, and the third one is pretty meh. It's like the Godfather trilogy in terms of quality. Enjoy the first two, but you can totally pass on the third if you want.
Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
If you are a massive fan of survival horror, you knew Silent Hill 2 would be number one on this list. All of the titles I've mentioned previously are great games for newcomers to experience the genre and what it does best. But Silent Hill 2, in my opinion, and honestly pretty much everyone else's, is the epitome of survival horror and is the greatest game in the genre and one of the greatest games of all time. In Silent Hill 2, you play as James Sunderland, a seemingly normal man who looks about as generic as possible. He received a letter from his wife telling him to come to the town of Silent Hill and meet her at their special place.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill.
This sounds really romantic. Who doesn't want to go to a nice town, hang out with their wife or partner? The only problem with this is James's wife, Mary, died 3 years ago.
I got a letter. The name on the envelope said Mary. My wife's name. It's ridiculous. Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. A dead person can't write a letter.
I have given a pretty decent breakdown of the plot of all the previous games I have mentioned on this list, so I can give you like an idea of what the game is about while also trying to pique your interest. But with Silent Hill 2, I'm not doing any of that. Mainly because this game is something you should experience blind. The beauty of Silent Hill 2 is experiencing it and deciphering what it all means. Not only for the protagonist, but the other characters, the enemies, the items, and the world. The narrative of Silent Hill 2 is complex, heartbreaking, terrifying, and explores and takes advantage of the psychology of everyone who sets foot into the foggy town. It taps into something many other games don't and offers an experience that will leave you questioning everything you just witnessed. The town of Silent Hill is also my favorite place in all of horror fiction. It is a resort town covered in fog and feels ripped right out of a Stephen King novel, which is one of the developer's main influences. The fog simultaneously instills calm in the player while hiding all of the horrors. You never know what could be hiding in the thick and oppressive fog. Things aren't always so serene in the town though. It has a much darker side. Several times throughout the game, the town takes on a different personality. Everything becomes dark, grimy, and twisted. Silent Hill is not a safe place, but when it shows the darkness hidden behind the fog, it becomes something made of nightmares. Even with the gameplay, I do not want to go into too much detail. Basically, it plays like any survival horror game from the PS1 to PS2 era. It is clunky, slow, and deliberate. It is nowhere near as fluid as all the previous titles I have mentioned, but that was a deliberate design decision. It was the point. The lack of control disarms the player, makes every situation that much more tense, and reflects how the protagonist isn't a soldier or a fighter. He is a normal person, and the controls and his combat abilities reflect that. It will take some time to get used to, but give it time and it will become natural. Getting over this hurdle is well worth it. Silent Hill 2 is the survival horror game. Even though it is a sequel, it has absolutely no connection to the previous game either. It is its own beast. If you have any interest in survival horror games or just horror in general, you need to experience Silent Hill 2. It is one of the greatest pieces of horror fiction to ever exist, and it's calling for you. So, are you going to accept?